When theologians, liturgical scholars, and thousands of bishops see the church in a particular way, my friends, that impacts and affects how Catholics live and worship. For example, when their vision of the church is one of a primarily hierarchical institution, that will affect and impact a great many things. However, when their vision of the church is primarily as the people of God, that too will impact and affect a great many things. Ecclesiology is that branch of theology concerning the ecclesia, the church. Literally, it is the study of the church, from the Greek logos, or study of, or words about, and ecclesia for assembly and church. But to call ecclesiology merely the study of the church would be too generic, too etymological a definition. Many other disciplines study the church that you should not call ecclesiological. History studies the church. Anthropology studies the church. Political science studies the church. Sociology studies the church. Philosophy studies the church. These are not necessarily ecclesiological in bent. Ecclesiology is therefore the theological study of the church. This means that it studies the church as mystery, as sacrament, a visible sign of the unseen presence of God. Ecclesiology is the name given to the systematically organized theological treatise of the church. It is the particular theological way in which the church sees itself. In order to taste the importance and impact of ecclesiology, imagine going to Holy Mass somewhere in the United States, or pretty much anywhere in the world, in a Latin Rite Catholic church sometime in the 1950s. Some of you may have memories of that experience.
15 years old.
Imagine the priest is at the altar with his back to the congregation while he recites prayers in Latin in a barely audible manner. What is the ecclesiological message that is being given by what you are seeing? It should be clear. The message, the ecclesiological message given, is that the priest is the one who makes the Mass happen. The old textbooks of theology referred to it as confecting the Eucharist. And what about lay people? What is the message about what the lay people are doing and who the lay people are? According to this ecclesiological message, the clear message is that the laity, according to this ecclesiological portrait and message, are present essentially as onlookers, passive onlookers, fulfilling their weekly obligation to be present for the three main parts of the Mass, and only the three main parts, which in these days were the offertory, the consecration, and Holy Communion. Here's another theological message, another message of ecclesiology. What do you not see there? You don't see girls. There are no altar girls. Another clear ecclesiological message. No females on the sanctuary. The altar boys are there, however, signaling the approach of the consecration by the ringing of a small bell. What do these three rings correspond to, or warn the lay people, the dumb laity, about? The three important points that they have to be present at: the offertory, the consecration, and communion. What is the ecclesiological message? These two, my friends, are messages, clear messages, if not explicit, signaling the times of importance, signaling who is important and who is not, signaling who does what and when. And some Catholics of this day and age, the 1950s, made no special effort to be at church in time for the start of Mass because they knew that they had some leeway, didn't they? The offertory did not begin until the priest removed the chalice veil and the altar boys made a dash for the table containing the cruets filled with wine and water. And no one left church before communion, which was the third and last obligatory part of the Mass. Not to be present for all three parts of the Mass. Three parts of the Mass. Listen, it's parts. And we're not talking liturgy of the Word and liturgy of the Eucharist. We're talking the three parts of the Mass. And not to be present for all three of these obligatory parts of the Mass was tantamount to not fulfilling one's weekly obligation to keep holy the Sabbath, which puts you in mortal sin. In which case, you have totally, fundamentally, and utterly turned your back on God and His grace and are hell-bound. This was impressed and impressed and impressed and impressed on generations. Again, another clear ecclesiological message. However, once the tabernacle door was opened and people began coming forward for Holy Communion, some then did head for the exits and the parking lot. After all, they had fulfilled their obligation. Look at another clear ecclesiological message given in the 1950s Mass. The people in the pews were completely silent throughout the Mass, except for the children's Mass, when a young people would be led in prayers and songs whose texts had no direct connection with those of the Eucharist itself. Another clear ecclesiological message: there was no offertory procession. The congregation, the synaxis, did not participate. They didn't give anything except their tithe and their obligation to show up. The people had no role in presenting the gifts to be consecrated. What is the ecclesiological message there, my friends? Another clear ecclesiological message: with the ringing of the bells, the congregation was stirred from maybe daydreaming. Perhaps they were interrupted from perusing the bulletin, the parish bulletin. Or perhaps they were interrupted from doing their private devotion, more likely the rosary. Relatively few in the congregations of these times actually followed the Mass with a missal. And priests said Masses. You still hear this. Father said his first Mass. What's the message there? Ushers returned from the vestibule or from outside where some had gone for a quick smoke. They're not doing nothing wrong. After all, they're only obligated to be present at a certain very limited time. Right? Another clear ecclesiological message: the entire assembly would be hushed as the priest bent over the bread and the wine to bring God down onto the altar through the recitation of the sacred words, Hoc est anim corpus meum. This is my body. Hoc est anim corpus meum. What does that sound like, ladies and gentlemen? Hoc est anim corpus meum. Hocus pocus. See where that's just an anti-Catholic thing with that expression. for this is the chalice of my blood. Remember in the second translation for the post-Vatican II Mass in English, it was, cup. But then they translated it back to calix, chalice. Why do you think they did that? What's the clear ecclesiological message? And then, after those sacred words of consecration, would come the coughing, the rumbling of kneelers, and the general sense of returning to ordinary time, would shatter the reverential silence of the moment. The rest of the service was almost anticlimactic. The priest recited the Pater Noster, the Lord's Prayer. There was no handshake of peace, not even for the altar boys, who then made their second dash to the cruet table to retrieve the communion plates. Communion plates. In some churches of this time, the altar boys held the plates under the chins of the kneeling communicants while the priest distributed the sacrament. What's the clear ecclesiological message? If we're sharing a meal together, you give me do you invite people into your home and cut their food for them and feed them, say, open up, bzzz, open up? Is that how you do it? Or do you let them feed themselves? There was only the post-communion prayer, the blessing, the last gospel, and the prayers at the foot of the altar for the conversion of Russia that remained to be recited. The altar boy would then retrieve the priest's biretta. The celebrant brought down the recovered chalice from the altar, and there was a short procession back into the sacristy. And that was that for another week. Another clear ecclesiological message. And so much of Catholic social media wants to go back to this time. The overall message was clear in this completely valid Eucharist. The church of this time was giving a clear ecclesiological message that said, for all practical purposes, the hierarchy and the clergy is what is meant by the word church. But what about the lay people? Laity belonged to the church for three purposes: to pray, pay, and obey. This was because theologians, liturgical scholars, and thousands of bishops for many, many, many years prior to the 1950s saw the church in a particular way, namely, primarily as a hierarchical institution. That was their ecclesiology. It had stuck and become the dominant view. And in the eyes of many people, romanticists, fundamentalist Catholics who want to go back to that time, the only true view.